In 628 CE, an oasis of stone and iron waited in the north. Khaybar wasn't really a city at all. It functioned as a whole system, a chain of fortified strongholds built up over generations, packed with stored food, weapons, and defenders convinced that time stood firmly on their side. Walls sat high along volcanic ridges. Fields produced enough to feed entire armies, and the name Khaybar carried real weight everywhere in Arabia. Yet within just months, that entire setup would collapse. What took place at Khaybar never looked like one big battle. Nobody charged thunderously across an open plain, and no sudden collapse arrived in a single afternoon of blood. Pressure built instead. Days stretched slowly into weeks. Gates stayed firmly shut. Men simply waited, then waited longer still. And quietly at first, everything started giving way. This tells how an oasis engineered to outlast siege after siege finally ran out of time. It actually starts not at Khaybar itself, but in a compromise reached earlier that same year. Muhammad, along with the community in Medina, signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah together with the Quraysh from Mecca. Outsiders saw it as a step back. No pilgrimage allowed, no victory parade, only a pause in the fighting. Beneath that surface appearance, though, Hudaybiyyah quietly shifted the strategic balance across Arabia, and for the first time in years, Medina's southern side sat secure. That new security released attention, and fighting men to turn their eyes northward. Roughly 150 kilometers north of Medina sat Khaybar, an oasis holding fertile ground amid a landscape that otherwise stayed harsh and unforgiving. In date palms drove its wealth, while layers of fortification gave it safety. Instead of depending on one long wall, Khaybar formed a scattered network of strongholds, each one built to resist on its own, and each protecting the paths leading toward the others. People living there treated war not as an event that comes and goes, but as a permanent state they had prepared for. A good number of the Jewish families in Khaybar had come there after earlier troubles in Medina. Some started as strong allies, turned into bitter enemies, and ended up as exiles. Once settled in the oasis, they rebuilt their position. Economically, the place flourished. Militarily, it grew tougher. And politically, it turned into a real center of resistance where opposition to Medina could gather again, make plans, and simply bide its time. Waiting formed the core of Khaybar's whole strategy. Attacking a place like that looked illogical from the outside. Siege work moved slowly, carried heavy risks, and cost far more than most could afford. An attacker might lose strength long before the defender ever felt hunger. Khaybar's defenders understood that reality perfectly. Stockpiles sat ready, wells stayed deep, positions commanded high ground. Victory for them never required crushing the enemy in open fight. Outlasting him would do. Even so, during the early months of 628 CE, roughly 14 to 1,600 men, sources differ slightly on the exact count, marched north from Medina. The numbers alone made the point clear. This expedition came ready to remain, not just strike and leave. When the Muslim force drew near Khaybar, no dramatic clash erupted, no horn sounded, and no sudden ambush sprang up. Defenders pulled back behind stone and heavy timber, locking themselves inside the forts. Open land suddenly felt sealed shut. Every ridge hit a wall. Every path curved beneath watchful eyes. Those opening days tested patience far more than raw strength. Several assaults went forward only to be driven back. Arrows rained down from above. Stones followed close behind. The fortresses refused to yield. Attackers pulled away, gathered themselves, and pressed forward again. Each setback drove home the same hard truth. Khaybar refused to fall quickly. Siege psychology works that way. Fear rarely spikes in one sharp moment. Erosion happens instead. Doubt creeps in during the dark hours. Supplies demand careful rationing. Morale requires constant attention. With every new sunrise, the same question hung over the camp: how much longer can this go on? Inside the forts, defenders kept close watch. They had watched attackers arrive and depart before. Walls gave them confidence. Time gave even more. Certain accounts mention possible alliances that could have marched to help Khaybar, yet no real support ever appeared. Hesitation, sheer distance, shifting political currents, whatever the cause, expected relief never came. Pressure from outside kept building. Leadership counted here not through grand sweeping moves, but through quiet choices repeated at dawn and again at dusk. Which stronghold to cut off completely, which one to test with probes, which to leave untouched for the moment. Heroic gestures played no part. Systems pressed steadily against other systems. Little by little, the outer defenses started cracking. One stronghold gave way, then the next followed. Brute force didn't always cause the fall. Isolation did the heavier work. Cut away from fields, cut away from help coming from neighboring forts. Even the strongest place grew vulnerable, once left on its own. Every lost position carried a message straight to the next line of walls. Marhab ibn al-Harith stood out among the defenders, remembered later as a powerful warrior and respected leader. His very presence carried Khaybar's sense of certainty. As long as figures like Marhab held firm, the whole arrangement seemed unbreakable. Systems, though, live on momentum. Weeks replaced days, and fatigue settled over both sides. Attackers traded bright expectations for plain, stubborn persistence. Among defenders, growing cracks appeared in what once felt like rock-solid certainty. Forts meant to purchase time began eating it instead. Food stock shrank steadily, spirits wore thin, and the plain fact that no major relief force would arrive forced everyone to rethink their math. That moment brought a real turning point. Not one that finished the siege in a single stroke, but one that bent its entire direction. Command of a decisive assault passed to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Later stories wrapped the event in layers of symbolism, yet at its core, the move stayed practical. Momentum carried weight, confidence carried weight, and the siege desperately needed proof that no wall stood beyond reach. Fighting that followed stayed fierce yet tightly contained. Marhab died in hand-to-hand combat, an event noted across several historical accounts. His death failed to stop the larger struggle right then, but it carried real meaning. Symbols move quicker than soldiers during a siege. Losing a key defender sent echoes rolling through every remaining fort. From there, collapse arrived not in a rush, but steadily and without pause. One stronghold after another either opened talks or simply fell. Qamus, counted among the very last and strongest, eventually surrendered too. The system that had shaped Khaybar across generations no longer held together as one piece. What came next avoided massacre and skipped simple expulsion. Negotiations took over instead. People of Khaybar received permission to stay on their land working as cultivators, provided they handed over a share, usually remembered as half, of the agricultural yield. Control changed hands, ownership shifted, yet life carried on in a narrower, conditional way. Safiya bint Huyai, daughter of a prominent Jewish leader, ended up among those taken captive. She later married Muhammad, a fact recorded carefully in the sources and understood in many different ways, depending on time and community. Within the immediate setting of Khaybar, that marriage reflected how political breakdown tangled together with personal paths and lineage. By the point the expedition made its way back to Medina, power across northern Arabia had tilted noticeably. Wealth once held inside Khaybar now moved outward. The strategic danger disappeared, and fortresses that used to signal permanence stood quiet. The real lesson coming out of Khaybar never centered on walls or weapons alone. Time itself formed the heart of it. Khaybar had been engineered to survive repeated attacks. And yet sustained pressure without any rescue proved too much. The siege exposed a hard truth. Even the most solid setups crumble once their core expectations no longer match reality. And in the months right after, people all across Arabia paid close attention. Because when Khaybar fell, nothing seemed quite as fixed and unshakable as it once had. The early losses among the outer forts already changed how the whole campaign felt. Khaybar never planned to collapse in one dramatic sweep. Its real strength came from those overlapping layers. If one position went down, the next should take the strain and keep going. That was the design on paper. In reality, each defeat made holding the remaining lines that much tougher. Once those first breakthroughs happened, the ground around the oasis started looking different. What used to feel like one continuous chain of stone suddenly appeared broken and disconnected. Routes, once guarded by several strongholds, now lay open and exposed. Fields that once supplied the defenders turned risky to approach. The men inside still carried weapons and kept their discipline, but they no longer moved or fought like a single living thing. Siege warfare has this habit of peeling back every illusion. For the attackers, patience turned into the deadliest tool they owned. Nobody pushed for some final, massive battle. No reason existed to throw lives against walls that would probably open eventually anyway. The pressure kept coming, steady and deliberate. Strongholds got cut off one at a time, their water and farmland placed out of reach. Passing messages between forts grew harder by the day. Every sunrise without help arriving chipped away at determination. Inside those walls, choices started carrying heavier weight. Every meeting circled back to the same grim points. How much grain still sat in storage, how many more weeks the wells could hold out, whether any allies might still show up. And maybe most damaging of all, whether continuing to resist still made sense compared to the price being paid. Certain records talk about small sorties, quick rushes out to try breaking the encirclement. Those efforts gained almost nothing. The rocky ground strongly favored anyone shooting or dropping stones from above, not men advancing across open space. Each failed push only confirmed the obvious. The siege was doing exactly what it was meant to do. On the attacking side, commanders stayed focused on holding everyone together. A long campaign like this invited boredom just as easily as it invited fear. Soldiers who had marched out expecting a fast win now dealt with endless routine, standing watch, quiet nights, staying in the same small area day after day. Keeping order and purpose alive under those conditions mattered every bit as much as courage shown in actual fighting. Slowly talks began to appear here and there. Not every fort fell after a direct assault. A number opened negotiations before hunger forced even harsher conditions. Those conversations stayed practical and to the point. They centered on land, on who would work it, and on simple survival. Defenders understood clearly that the oasis and its harvest formed the true prize. That single fact shaped the final outcome far more than any abstract principle. Each time one stronghold reached an agreement, the effect spread outward like ripples. Every place that gave up told the others still holding out the same unwelcome message. Resistance had stopped being a shared effort. It had become an individual decision. Qamus stood out as one of the toughest remaining positions, well-placed, still decently supplied, carrying the last real symbol of Khaybar's confidence. As long as Qamus refused to yield, the whole idea of holding firm stayed alive. Its surrender, whether taken by storm or handed over through terms, marked the definite close of any organized defense. When Qamus finally gave way, the siege passed an invisible threshold. No backup layers remained. No fallback strongpoints waited. Only one question stayed on the table. What terms would end this? The settlement that followed blended clear victory with measured restraint. Nobody forced the inhabitants out right away. They received the right to stay put and keep cultivating the fields they knew best, on the condition they turn over a fixed share, most accounts say half, of everything they grew. Control passed to new hands and ownership shifted, but daily life continued under tighter rules. That arrangement delivered several practical benefits at once. It locked in steady economic gain without wrecking the land's output. It lowered any chance of widespread hunger. And it set an example of ruling through management instead of outright destruction. For the people of Khaybar, existence went on, though now within strict limits. Independence disappeared. Safety depended entirely on compliance. Survival itself remained possible. Certain personal stories survived from those days, preserved unevenly through the sources. Safiya bint Huyai, daughter of a leading Jewish figure, fell into captivity during the campaign. Her eventual marriage to Muhammad appears carefully noted in the records and carries different meanings depending on who tells the story and when. In the direct aftermath of Khaybar, that union showed how political collapse often tangled together with family lines and individual destinies in that era. With the siege wrapped up, the expedition turned south toward Medina. From a distance, the oasis looked unchanged. Same stone walls standing, same date palms stretching out. But the living network that once gave those things purpose had vanished completely. Khaybar's effects reached well beyond the oasis boundaries. Though Medina gained steady access to one of northern Arabia's richest farming zones, that inflow steadied resources and cut reliance on trade paths enemies could easily interrupt. On the military map, the northern route toward Medina lost its main fortified rival. Politically, the signal rang loud and clear. No matter how carefully built, defenses could come apart under patient, unrelenting pressure. Other groups took notice. Quiet realignments happened. People recalculated risks. Communities that once counted on outlasting any threat began rethinking their position. Khaybar turned into a benchmark, not remembered for some sudden wipeout, but for showing how certain defeat could arrive step by step. Even while its strategic weight grew, the memory of what happened there started breaking into pieces. In later generations picked out different pieces to highlight. Some stressed acts of individual bravery. Others pointed to legal patterns set by the surrender terms. A few turned the whole event into a broader symbol, pulled loose from its original details. Modern research handles the story more carefully. Figures vary depending on the account. Reasons get debated. Some alliances mentioned in older sources may have grown larger or simpler in the telling. What stays steady across versions is the basic structure. Khaybar, a heavily fortified oasis, fell through a drawn-out siege combined with negotiation, not through one sudden act of total destruction. That difference carries real importance. It pushes back against the notion that history only turns through loud, explosive turning points. A Khaybar shows endurance can prove just as decisive as raw force, and that lasting control often grows not from wiping something out, but from folding it in. In more recent times, the name Khaybar has surfaced now and then in political chants or arguments, usually stripped clean of its 7th century details and turned into a shorthand for confrontation. Historians point out that kind of use reveals far more about current tensions than it does about events in 628 CE. The real Khaybar resists boiling down to easy slogans. It refuses neat categories. The outcome arrived neither as outright slaughter nor as gentle handover. It came as a negotiated close to active resistance after an entire system buckled under steady strain. And that buckling never felt certain from the start. Allies might have arrived in time. Supplies could have held out longer. The attacker's patience might have cracked first. The whole story could easily have ended another way. History often swings not on fate, but on who manages to hold steady longer. That explains why Khaybar carried weight. It marked the moment when resistance built around distance and strong walls could no longer count on staying safe forever. It proved even the best prepared defenses could break apart without hurry, without fanfare, and without one single climactic fight. In the years that came afterward, the memory of Khaybar spread far past those volcanic ridges. It showed up in written chronicles, in arguments over law, in public teachings, and eventually in modern political speech. Each version emphasized something new: courage, belief, tactics, authority. Underneath every layer rests the same quiet fact: Khaybar fell because its strategy depended on time staying on its side, and time slipped away. The oasis had prepared itself to wait out any attacker. What it could not handle was an opponent ready to wait even longer. That remains the lasting point of Khaybar. Walls still serve a purpose. Strength still counts for something. But any system, no matter how solid, lasts only as long as the beliefs holding it together stay true. When those beliefs collapse, the end does not have to arrive with noise and drama. It only has to keep coming, day after day. And back in 628 CE, patience turned out to be exactly what finally forced the gates of Khaybar. With the expedition finally back in Medina, no grand celebration greeted their return. No carved monuments rose to announce victory, and no sweeping proclamations echoed through the streets. What had happened at Khaybar revealed itself slowly. In the quiet ways, the whole region began to settle into a changed reality. Khaybar no longer stood apart as an independent power. For years, the oasis had served as a key pivot in northern Arabia, rich enough to bankroll opposition, strong enough to protect it, and far enough away to imagine it could dictate its own conditions. After 628 CE, that equation broke. The date harvests and other crops now fed into Medina's growing system, steadying supplies, and easing the constant worry over routes that enemies could cut at any moment. That economic breathing room proved just as valuable as any battlefield success. Armies survive on more than resolve alone. They need reliable food, dependable logistics, and a sense that tomorrow won't bring sudden shortages. Khaybar delivered all of those under new management. The fields kept producing. The people who knew the land best kept working it. And the surplus strengthened an emerging structure of control rather than feeding a rival fortress. On the strategic side, the campaign left a clear blueprint for what came next. Patient, disciplined sieges could succeed when handled with care. The Medina force never tried to storm every position at the same time. Commanders picked one stronghold, separated it from the rest, starved its connections, and waited for the defenders to face hard choices. Speed never won the day. Steady application of pressure did. That method became something others would study and repeat. Later expeditions would carry the same lessons forward. Lock down your flanks first, remove sources of wealth that could sustain resistance, and skip needless open field clashes whenever time worked in favor of methodical strangulation. In that way, Khaybar served not just as a finished chapter, but as practice for conflicts still on the horizon. The story's meaning, though, never stayed locked inside strategy and trade alone. Over the decades that followed, Khaybar gathered extra layers of significance. Early Islamic scholars turned to the surrender terms when they discussed land rights, tribute systems, and how to handle populations brought under new rule. The decision to let the original inhabitants stay on as farmers, paying a share of the yield, became a point of reference, sometimes followed closely, sometimes adjusted, as jurists worked out principles of governance. Memory, however, rarely stays pure. As time passed, the event grew simpler in the retelling. Its drawn-out nature and careful negotiations often shrank away. In some versions, the long siege turned into one sharp, heroic encounter. In others, the whole affair hardened into a symbol far removed from the dusty ridges and palm groves where it actually unfolded. Contemporary historians pick their way through those accumulated layers with caution. They see how early accounts carried the weight of recollection, politics, and religious framing. Exact counts shift from one source to the next. Timelines sometimes blur. Certain personalities appear larger in some traditions than in others. Still, the fundamental outline holds firm across the differences. A heavily defended oasis fell to prolonged encirclement and eventual agreement, not to instant overwhelming force. And that basic distinction carries lasting weight. It undercuts the idea that only sudden, shattering moments drive historical change. Khaybar demonstrates that quiet persistence can prove every bit as conclusive as aggressive fury, and that real dominance frequently arrives not through erasure, but through integration on new terms. In our own era, the name Khaybar occasionally reappears in heated rhetoric or rallying cries, usually stripped of its original setting and repurposed as a blunt emblem of conflict. Those who study the period observe that such invocations reveal far more about modern frustrations than they do about the oasis in 628 CE. The historical Khaybar defies reduction to catchphrases. It resists clean labels. The outcome emerged neither as wholesale slaughter nor as harmonious merger. It arrived as a pragmatic end to armed defiance once a carefully constructed system gave way under unrelenting strain, and that collapse never felt predestined at the outset. Reinforcements might have reached the defenders. Food reserves could have stretched further. The besiegers' resolve might have faltered before the forts did. The entire outcome hung on variables that could easily have tipped the other direction. History frequently pivots not on inevitability, but on who manages to endure the longest. That is precisely why Khaybar left such a deep mark. It signaled the end of any comfortable assumption that distance and sturdy walls guaranteed permanent safety. It showed that even the most thoughtfully prepared network of defenses could unravel without haste, without spectacle, and without depending on one decisive clash. In the centuries since then, the memory of Khaybar has traveled widely. It surfaced in historical records, in legal discussions, in religious instruction, and eventually in contemporary political language. Each retelling chose its own emphasis: personal valor, religious commitment, tactical brilliance, rightful authority. Beneath every variation, the same understated reality persists. Khaybar fell because its entire plan rested on time remaining an ally, and time changed sides. The oasis had fortified itself to outweight any aggressor. What it could not overcome was an opponent prepared to outweigh it in return. That remains the central insight carried by Khaybar. Walls retain their function. Military strength still matters. Yet every system, however imposing, endures only as long as the premises supporting it continue to hold. When those premises collapse, the breakdown does not require thunder and drama. It merely requires consistency. And in 628 CE, consistency turned out to be the force patient enough to open Khaybar's gates at last.